Right after I set my mother's framed photo on the easel at her memorial, my sister pointed at me in front of 50 people and shouted, "The $900,000 house is mine. Dad already signed it over. You need to be out by the end of the week." The room went silent. Forks stopped halfway to plates, cups hung in mid-air, and then the whispers started along the walls of the fellowship hall. Of course she was going to try to keep the house, someone near the coffee pots murmured. She only took care of their mother for that. My name is Maya. And in that moment, no one saw the daughter who moved back home, changed dressings, argued with insurance companies, and slept on a recliner by a hospital bed. They saw a quiet nurse in worn flats who suddenly looked like a thief. Lena stood in a tight black dress that looked more like a club outfit than funeral clothes, one hand on her hip, the other waving a folded transfer deed. "Dad signed this," she said, her voice sharp. "He promised me the house. I am the one who made him happy at the end. You were never around." Behind her, her boyfriend Travis leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. "No way some low-paid nurse gets to sit on a $900,000 asset," he said just loud enough. "Everybody knows you cannot build a real life on what she makes." I felt humiliation climb my throat. I opened my mouth, then shut it, when I saw my father near the back, his shoulders lost in a suit that used to fit. His eyes had that cloudy look from his early dementia, the look that meant he was fighting to understand where he was. Lena turned toward him. "Tell her Dad," she urged, holding the deed so the shaky signature caught the light. "You remember. You told me the house would be mine because I bring you joy." He stared at the paper, then at me, lips moving before a few broken words came out. "House. Lena. Yes." The room grabbed those fragments and turned them into a judgment. To them, it sounded like proof. "The house is hers. You are nothing." An aunt shook her head at me. "You cannot fight your own sister over a roof," she said. "Your mother would be ashamed." That sentence cut deeper than anything else. Not the house, not the money, but the way they were ready to believe I was greedy after months of wiping my mother's forehead, driving her to chemo, working nights at Salem Health to pay for pills her plan did not cover. Lena had breezed in with balloons and a phone held high and still somehow stayed the golden child. Now she took a step closer, heels clicking on the tile. "The deed is done," she said and smiled. "This place is not yours anymore. Mom's gone. Dad chose. So start packing." Beside her, Travis gave a short laugh. 7 days, he added. "That is what the law says." I could feel everyone watching, waiting for me to fall apart. Instead, I looked at her. Really looked. At the glitter on her eyelids, at the bag on her arm she could not afford, at the way her hand shook just a little as she held the deed. She was performing, but she was also cornered. That told me something. "You are very sure of yourself," I said quietly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. A faint line appeared between her brows before she smoothed her face. "I have every right to be sure," she snapped. "Dad wanted this. And there is one more thing." Her gaze moved over the room like she was about to drop a final twist. Then she paused. "Not yet," she said. "Another time. Let her sit with this first." The cruelty of it should have crushed me. Instead, something inside me went still. She thought she knew my whole life. She thought I was just the broke daughter in scrubs who drove an old Toyota and should be grateful for whatever scraps she allowed me to keep. She had no idea about the life I had been building quietly in the background, about the properties with my name on the deeds, about the credit line sitting in my wallet. She had no idea that while she chased attention and easy money, I was learning how to protect what little we had. I let my eyes travel over the faces turned toward me, then to the woman from Martin and Cole Law, near the doorway, the card she had given me earlier, already warm in my hand, then back to my father, swaying between clarity and fog. The shame in my chest shifted into something sharper, not rage, decision. If you have ever been painted as selfish by the very people you sacrificed yourself for, you already know what started in me right then. That was the moment I decided I would not let my sister's lie become the story everyone believed about me, about my mother, or about our home. Word count, approximately 870. Right after the memorial ended and the room finally emptied enough for me to breathe again, I walked into the quiet of the Maple Ridge house, the $900,000 relic of my mother's side of the family, the house that held the ghost of every argument and every sacrifice we had ever lived through, and I tried to steady myself as the sting of what Lena had done lingered in every corner. But the truth was that the story of this betrayal had not begun. Today, it had started long before the memorial, long before the transfer deed she waved like a trophy, long before the whispers that painted me greedy. It started with the small wound she cut into my father months earlier, the day she told him a lie that reshaped the way he saw me. Maya told Mom she did not want to see you anymore, she had said in her sugary voice while I was at work, and Dad, already unsteady in his memory, already drifting between clarity and confusion, believed her without hesitation. That was the first twist in a path that led to the disaster at the memorial, and I only learned about it when he looked at me one evening and asked if I was still angry at him, his voice trembling like a child expecting punishment. I remember sitting on the edge of his bed, hearing him repeat Lena's lie in fragments, and feeling the floor of my chest fall out, because I realized she had been building this narrative for months while I was busy helping Mom survive one more treatment. The injustice lived in the bones of this house, a place that had belonged to my grandparents before it passed into my mother's, name a house with a wraparound porch that creaked in winter storms, a house filled with old quilt baskets and photographs from fairs and river trips, a house that had both sentimental weight and very real financial value in a rising Oregon market. People in West Salem would joke that properties in Maple Ridge never truly sold. They stayed in families like heirlooms, each generation layering their belongings onto the last. I had spent the last 3 years keeping this house alive, paying contractors to fix the leaking skylight replacing the electrical panel, when the old one sparked covering medical supplies on top of rising utility costs, and doing it while working shifts at the hospital that left grooves in my palms and circles under my eyes. Lena never saw any of that. She arrived only for birthdays, holidays, and whatever gatherings allowed her to appear as the charming younger daughter, and even then she rarely stayed long. Yet somehow she became the one our relatives saw as the gentle soul Mom loved most, while I was painted as the pragmatic older daughter who never showed enough softness. The injustice deepened the moment I stepped into the living room after the memorial, when Aunt Carol called me aside and said not to be selfish. Lena always had a special place in your mother's heart. You know that. As if love could erase responsibility, as if charm could replace caregiving, as if showing up for hospitals and emergencies and late-night fevers counted less because it came from me. I stood there nodding, while my mind drifted back to all the nights I had held Mom steady while she vomited from chemo, all the early mornings when I changed her bedding, all the bills I paid without asking for help. Lena never saw those moments, and to her they did not matter because they were not visible. They did not draw attention. They did not earn applause. She once laughed in my face and said, "You are just a walking ATM. You know that a machine that pays for everything, so I do not have to." She said it with that smirk that meant she did not think I had the spine to push back, but it stayed with me, like a bruise that never fully healed. Walking through the house now, I could feel the pressure of everything pressing against my ribs, the whispers from relatives, the guilt twisting through my father, the way Lena had fed him lies until he clung to them as truth, and underneath all of it, the slow burn of my own exhaustion, the ache of giving and giving, until no one even noticed I was the one holding everything together. I picked up a throw blanket my mother crocheted years ago and sank onto the couch, letting the weight settle in my lap. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe everyone was right. Maybe I should have expected this. Maybe I should have known that caring for someone quietly is not the same as being cherished. That was when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I did not recognize. A short text with no greeting, no explanation. Only the question, "When can you sign for the second duplex?" My breath halted because that message belonged to a different part of my life, the part no one in my family knew about, the part I guarded, like a secret locked behind heavy doors. My hand tightened around the phone as the room around me shifted, because the family that saw me as a weak nurse in worn shoes had no idea that I had been building something entirely different in quiet corners and long nights, something that did not show on the surface. To them, I was just the daughter who stayed home, the daughter who carried the burdens, the daughter who drove a car with peeling paint. But they did not know about the investment books I read in break rooms, the spreadsheets on my laptop, the first duplex I bought through a local program for essential workers, the second duplex now, within reach, the one that would double my rental income. They did not know that while Lena spent nights at bars and brunches, I was calculating interest rates and comparing loan terms, planning a future where I would not have to beg anyone for stability. I stared at the message for a long time, and as I did, something in me clicked. The injustice that had piled on my shoulders was not just random. It had been crafted by people who never looked beyond their assumptions, people who believed they could decide my worth based on what they saw. And I realized I had allowed them to keep seeing me that way because it was easier than explaining what they would never understand. I stood up and walked to the hallway, where my mother's last note still sat in the small wooden box, the one where she wrote, "Protect our home." And I felt something straighten in my spine. Lena thought she had already won. She thought the humiliation at the memorial would break me so completely that I would step aside. She thought her lies about Dad would become the truth everyone accepted, but she had miscalculated the one thing she never understood about me. I do not break quietly. As I placed the phone back into my pocket, the house seemed to draw a long breath around me, and I understood that the seed of injustice Lena planted was about to bear consequences she never imagined. I can still feel the heat of the room when I think about the memorial, the heavy mix of perfume-wilted lilies, and the cheap catering trays that relatives poked at while pretending to be heartbroken. And as I replay the moment Lena stepped into the spotlight, I realize it was the first real drop in a long descent, the moment everything cracked open in front of everyone. She positioned herself directly under the ceiling light, the bright glow hitting her perfectly styled hair as if she had choreographed the whole scene, and she lifted the stack of papers high enough for every curious eye to see her chin tilted upward with smug triumph. And for a second, I felt the room shift toward her, like she was a performer entering stage left. She tapped the pages against her palm and announced in a clear voice that cut through the quiet, "I have something important to share since no one else is brave enough to say it," and before I could understand what she was doing, she pointed at me with the tip of the document and said, "This one here has been living off a dying woman." The words stabbed through the air, sharp as glass, and the whole room gasped, as if she had revealed some scandalous secret they were waiting to confirm. Then she added, "She is a leech, a parasite. Someone who pretends to care so she can claim a house she never deserved." I could hear the whispers ignite instantly like dry brush catching fire, the hiss of disapproval spreading along the row of chairs where relatives who never visited Mom sat with judgment ready on their tongues. And I heard one of my cousins whisper loudly enough to be heard, "She only took care of her mother for the inheritance, you know how she is." My throat tightened, and I felt my pulse spike as every pair of eyes turned toward me, some pitying, some cynical, some gleeful in the way only toxic family members can be when given a reason to pick apart the quiet one. My knees felt weak, but I held myself still, the same way I did during Mom's long nights, steady and silent even though the humiliation burned through me like acid. Lena took one dramatic step closer to the framed photo of Mom and said, "Dad already fixed everything before Mom passed, so do not act surprised." Then she held up the paper again and waved it like a victory flag. "This is the deed, the house is mine." Her voice rang out so loudly someone in the back flinched. Then she turned back to me and hissed, "You ate off her plate while planning to steal her home." I felt something inside me twist so hard it almost snapped. But before I could speak, before I could breathe, Travis stepped into the circle of attention with that smug grin he always wore when he was about to make a scene, and he hooked his thumb casually into the pocket of his dress pants, as if this was just another brunch argument, then said in a tone dripping with condescension, "We are giving you 7 days to move out. That is the law." His voice carried across the room, and I heard someone gasp again, because Americans, especially older ones, despise the image of family members throwing each other out over property. It hit something deep and unsettling, and I saw several relatives shake their heads, but none of them said anything to stop him. He crossed his arms and added, "If you refuse, we will start the eviction process, because we are not playing games." And the way he said "we," as if he was legally tied to our family, made bile rise in my throat. My father stood behind them, confused and trembling slightly, and he looked between the two of us like a man lost in fog. Then he murmured, "The house is Lena's right. That is what I signed." His voice wavered in that heartbreaking way. Early dementia robs clarity from the elderly, and when he asked me, "You did not want to live there anyway, did you?" my chest tightened so painfully I almost doubled over because I could hear Mom's voice echoing in my memory, telling me to protect our home. I swallowed hard, forcing the tears back because crying would have only fed Lena's narrative, and I stood with my arms lowered at my sides while the humiliation burned through the inside of my throat like swallowed fire. The worst part was not even the insults or the deed she flaunted or Travis pretending to know the law. It was that no one stepped in to defend me. No one said Maya was the one who bathed her. Maya was the one who changed the dressings. Maya was the one who held her hand while the rest of you went on vacations. No one said a word because they had already decided their version of the story before the memorial even began. And yet, just as I felt myself unraveling, just as the noise of judgment began to ring in my ears, a woman I had never seen before approached quietly from the corner of the room and stood near me without saying anything for a long moment. I noticed her because she carried herself with a confidence that did not belong to this messy family circus. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "Call me when you are ready." She slipped a small card into my hand and walked away before I could even respond. And when I glanced down, I saw the clean lettering that read, "Martin and Cole, Law Senior Probate Specialist," and something tightened in my chest for a very different reason. I did not know her. She did not owe me anything. Yet the way she watched the humiliation unfold told me she had seen similar situations before, situations where the quiet sibling gets trampled by the louder one. Situations where manipulation and elder vulnerability twist the truth into something unrecognizable. I tucked the card into my pocket with slow movements, careful not to draw attention because Lena was still parading the deed in front of anyone who would look at it, and I realized in that moment that she believed this public spectacle had ended me, that she had already secured her win. But the humiliation, the whispered accusations, the threat of eviction, and the confusion flickering in my father's eyes did not crush me the way she wanted. Instead, it sharpened something inside me, something steady and unflinching. And as I stood there beneath the dim memorial lights, I understood that Lena had made one critical mistake. She thought she knew everything about me. She thought the worn shoes and the long shifts and the quiet presence meant I had no resources, no strength, no backup. She had no idea what was coming. I thought the humiliation at the memorial would buy me a few days of silence, maybe even a brief pause while everyone recovered from the spectacle Lena created. But the very next morning, she proved that whatever line she had crossed the day before was not the end, but the beginning of a series of deliberate attacks meant to push me out of the house, one blow at a time. And as I look back now, I can see how each loop tightened around me until breathing felt almost impossible. It started when I came home from a double shift, the kind that leaves my feet aching and my eyes burning with exhaustion, and I walked up the porch steps ready to collapse into bed, only to find the key refusing to turn in the lock. I twisted it again, then again, thinking the humidity had swollen the frame like it sometimes did in late spring, but the door did not budge, and a cold understanding began to slide over my skin when I reached up and touched the deadbolt, feeling the telltale sharp edges of a brand new lock. My stomach twisted because I knew instantly what Lena had done, and when I stepped back and looked around the neighborhood to see if anyone had noticed me standing there like a stranger on my own porch, shame rose so quickly it made my throat sting. I had to call a locksmith just to get inside, and even though he tried to hide it, I could see the confusion in his eyes when I told him the truth. In the simplest way I could, my sister changed the lock without my consent, and his quiet nod told me he had seen this before too many times in this state, where elder abuse and inheritance wars turned families into enemies. As soon as I stepped inside, I smelled the faint trace of the candle Lena used when she wanted to make a point that this house was hers to reclaim, and the way she had moved items slightly just enough to let me know she had been here sent a wave of anger through me that kept me awake long after I should have fallen asleep. The next loop came less than 24 hours later, when I received a notification on my phone, a tag from Travis that I almost ignored because my brain was too tired to care about anything he posted. But when I clicked it open and saw the words on his public Facebook feed, my breath caught in a stunned gasp that tasted like humiliation all over again. Some people think they deserve wealth just because they played nurse, he wrote, adding a winking emoji that made the entire message feel more venomous, and the comments flooded in instantly. People who barely knew me, chiming in with their own misguided theories, one saying if she lived with her mom, she probably mooched for years, another adding that families need to stop enabling siblings who do nothing but take, and someone else writing the words that stung hardest, she should be ashamed for exploiting a sick parent. Even distant acquaintances from high school saw the post and joined in their comments shallow and cruel, and in the space of a few minutes the version of me they created took on a life of its own, a greedy caregiver milking a dying woman for a house she did not earn. I sat on the edge of my bed and scrolled through the thread, with my heart thudding painfully, because this was not just gossip. This was a digital noose tightening around my reputation, the kind of thing that spreads quietly through communities and workplaces and lingers like smoke long after the fire goes out. I wanted to respond to defend myself, but I knew that replying would only feed the frenzy, so I set the phone down and let the anger burn its way through me. Instead, a slow, controlled flame that shaped my resolve rather than consuming it. I thought I had reached the limit of what the week could throw at me, but the next twist sliced deeper than the others because it targeted the person most vulnerable in all of this, my father. I got a call from Bank of Oregon while I was in the middle of assisting a patient, the teller, speaking in a careful, measured tone as she said, "We have your father at the counter attempting to withdraw $38,000, and he seems confused about what the money is for." My legs went weak because I knew instantly that he had not gone there alone, and when I asked the teller if anyone was with him, she lowered her voice and whispered, "Your sister is here. She is the one telling him what to say." I felt sick, my pulse hammering in my ears as years of training in elder abuse protocols flashed through my mind because this was a textbook scenario, a manipulative adult child using the impaired parent to access funds they had no right to touch, and as I rushed to the bank, I could feel the panic tightening my chest with every mile. When I arrived, Dad was sitting in a chair near the front desk, looking small and frightened, mumbling something about needing to help Lena, and the teller gave me a sympathetic nod that nearly broke me. Lena was nowhere in sight by then, already vanished the moment things stopped going her way, but the damage she had done hung in the air like spilled oil. I knelt in front of Dad and held his trembling hands, while he blinked at me with confusion, softening his eyes, and in that moment, I felt grief mix with a fierce, protective rage because he had no defense against what she was doing. The teller quietly mentioned that she had refused the transaction because Dad could not articulate where the money was going, and that decision likely saved him from losing every dollar he had left. I thanked her with a voice that barely worked and drove Dad home with the uneasy sense that Lena was ramping up her attacks because she was terrified of losing her grip on the narrative she had crafted. I thought the worst had passed after the bank incident, but that night, when I returned home, I noticed immediately that something felt off the living room, too neat, too curated, as if someone had staged it, and the quiet was so heavy it made my skin prickle. I walked through the house, slowly checking each room, and it was not until I reached the corner where Mom kept her antique side table that the truth hit me so hard I had to grip the doorway to stay standing. The table was gone. So were the dining chairs and the framed cross-stitch Mom made in the 90s and the cedar chest that held family quilts. I opened my phone with shaking hands and searched Marketplace, typing in the words oak dining set and antique cedar chest because some part of me already knew what I would find, and within seconds the listings appeared. There they were, my mother's belongings photographed badly, but unmistakably ours, posted under an account with a username I recognized instantly as Lena Sold Handle. A cold fury surged through me, so intense it felt like my ribs were cracking under the pressure, because this was not just theft, it was violation, a stripping of history for quick cash, a calculated move to empty the house before she could force me out entirely. I stared at the listings until the images blurred, and in that moment something in me shifted from quiet endurance to something sharper, steadier, something that would not let this continue without consequence. And as the night settled around the house like a shroud, I knew the loops she kept throwing my way were about to twist back on her in ways she never expected. I came home the next evening with a weight in my chest that felt heavier than any double shift I had ever worked, thinking maybe I would get a moment of quiet to breathe and figure out how to fight back. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, something in the air felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes the back of your neck prickle. And when I reached the front door, I saw a bright white paper slapped against the wood with tape, so hastily applied, the edges curled upward. I leaned in to read it, and the words, "Final notice vacate," within 72 hours, slammed into me so hard my knees nearly buckled, the bold lettering shouting the threat, as if the person who wrote it wanted the entire neighborhood to witness my humiliation. My heart pounded painfully as I scanned the bottom of the notice and saw my father's shaky signature, a signature that did not belong there because he would never have written something like this if he understood what it meant. And a cold realization spread through my chest as I recognized the sloppy curve of the pen, the way someone had tried to mimic his writing, but pressed too hard on the strokes, the ink pooling, where it should have been light and faint. It was forged. Lena had faked an eviction notice and used Dad's name to give it weight, and the cruelty of that hit me harder than anything she had done so far, because it used the most vulnerable person in our family as a weapon against me. I stood there, gripping the paper tightly, my breath shallow as the streetlights flickered on around me, illuminating the driveway where I had spent years helping Mom out of the car, steadying her when her knees wobbled, guiding her through chemo fatigue without ever asking for thanks. And now, after all of it, after every sacrifice, someone was telling me I did not belong here, that I was disposable, invisible, replaceable. This house that held every memory of my mother, every photograph, every holiday dinner, every whispered goodnight, was being stripped away from me by a sister who had never spent a single night caring for her, and the injustice cut so deep I felt like I was bleeding inside. I walked into the house and felt its silence settle over me, a thick, muffling silence that made my chest ache because it reminded me of all the nights Mom slept down the hall while I stayed awake, listening for her breathing, listening for the small sounds that told me she was still alive. And suddenly, all of that work, All of that love felt meaningless in the eyes of people who never saw me as anything more than the older sister who should endure silently and never want anything for herself. I felt the old pain rise inside me, the kind that lives in middle-aged women who have carried too much for too long, the pain of being responsible for everyone, but never celebrated the pain of being the reliable one. Everyone calls first, but the last one. Anyone defends the pain of giving so much of yourself that people forget. It was a choice, not an obligation. I sat on the couch with the eviction notice trembling in my hands, and the truth washed over me with brutal clarity. They did not see me because they never wanted to. They saw only what made their lives easier. The nurse who could handle things, the daughter who would pay bills, the sibling who never asked for help. And now, when there was something valuable on the line, they turned me into the villain because it made their greed easier to swallow. My phone buzzed, then lighting up in the dim room, and when I looked at the screen, I saw a bank notification, a transfer alert tied to the joint account I had monitored during Mom's final months. The account meant to cover her care. The account I guarded carefully because every dollar mattered. The notification showed a $12,000 withdrawal from 3 weeks before Mom died, and my breath stilled as I stared at the date, my mind racing through the memory of that week, remembering the moment Lena had breezed into the house with a coffee cup and 40 minutes to spare, between some social outing and a hair appointment pretending to check on Mom, while barely glancing in her direction. Mom had been sleeping that afternoon thin and frail, her breath uneven as she drifted in and out of exhaustion, and I had assumed Lena was behaving herself for once. Now I understood that while I was helping Mom to the bathroom or preparing her medication, Lena had been stealing from her, using the knowledge that Mom was too weak to question anything to siphon money for reasons I could only guess but did not want to imagine. $12,000 gone, money meant for Mom's comfort. Money meant for her peace, taken by someone who had the audacity later to call me a parasite in front of 50 people. A tremor of rage moved through my arms, and I stood up, the kind of rage that does not make you reckless, but makes you focus sharp and painfully aware of every detail around you. And I walked slowly down the hallway to my mother's room, the soft yellow lamp still sitting on her nightstand, its glow spilling gently over the familiar quilt she kept folded at the foot of the bed. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and felt the depression in the cushion where her small body had once rested, and grief swept over me in a long breath that sounded like a quiet sob, but did not pull tears from my eyes because the anger held them back. There on the dresser sat a small wooden box carved with cherry blossoms, the one Mom used for keepsakes, and I reached for it slowly, my fingers brushing the smooth lid before lifting it open. Inside lay the handwritten note she left for me, her delicate script, slightly faded from the years she kept it tucked away, and I unfolded it with trembling hands. "Everything is yours. Protect our home." 7 words. 7 quiet, gentle words she wrote before her mind grew too clouded to hold thoughts together. 7 words meant for me alone, passed from her hand to mine like a blessing and a responsibility. As I stared at the note, something inside me hardened with a clarity so fierce it felt like stepping into sunlight after being trapped underground, and the brokenness I had carried all week began to knit itself into something steady and unshakable. I realized then that I would not be pushed out. I would not be erased. I would not allow my mother's final wish to be trampled by someone who treated her as a stepping stone to quick money, and whatever fear had lived in me before now dissolved into determination. I folded the note gently and held it against my chest, feeling Mom's presence settle around me like a warm shawl, and in that moment I made a silent promise, not out of revenge alone, but out of love, out of duty, out of truth. This home is mine to protect. The night I found my mother's note was the night something in me finally shifted from survival to action, and by the next morning the fog of grief had sharpened into a clarity I had not felt in months, a clarity that wrapped itself around my spine and held me steady as I stood barefoot in the kitchen, dialing the number on the business card the woman at the memorial had given me. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice did not when I said, "This is Maya Reed. I need to speak with someone at Martin and Cole as soon as possible." Within minutes, I was connected to an attorney named Allison Cole, her tone steady and professional, yet carrying a warmth that told me she had handled countless cases like mine. And once I began explaining everything, the words poured out of me in a rush. The forged eviction. Notice the locked doors, the stolen furniture, the $12,000 theft, the pressure Lena had placed on Dad at the bank. The humiliation at the memorial and the transfer deed she claimed gave her ownership of the house. I expected skepticism, maybe a soft sigh of pity, but instead, she listened with an intensity that grounded me. And when I finished, she said calmly, "First step, send me a picture of the deed she presented. I will check its validity." I took a photo immediately, the paper still lying on the kitchen table where I had dropped it after the memorial, and 2 minutes later the attorney called back with a tone that carried both surprise and something close to indignation. "This deed is invalid. Whoever created this did not follow Oregon probate requirements, and your father lacks the legal capacity to sign binding documents of this nature." Relief rushed into me so suddenly I had to grip the counter to stay upright. But it was not the quiet kind of relief that makes you want to cry. It was the fierce kind that pushes your heartbeat higher because you know the fight is finally beginning. Allison walked me through the next steps in a series of calm instructions. Contact the property title office and verify the deed has not been recorded. Contact your father's bank and report an unauthorized withdrawal. Gather any documents that prove you were the primary caregiver. Obtain medical records that confirm your father's cognitive condition at the time of the alleged signature. And I followed each instruction with mechanical precision, driven by a determination so strong it felt like momentum had taken over my body and was pulling me forward. When I called the title office, the clerk confirmed what Allison suspected. No transfer had been filed. No deed change existed in the county system. And the relief I felt then began to fuse with a quiet, powerful anger. Because Lena had not only tried to steal the house, she had done it so carelessly that she left a trail of sloppy lies behind her. Next, I contacted the bank and spoke to the fraud department, explaining that my father had attempted a large withdrawal under my sister's pressure, and when they pulled the audio notes and teller logs, they confirmed he had appeared confused and unable to articulate the purpose of the transaction, which meant the withdrawal attempt could be flagged for review as possible financial exploitation. Each answer I received, each confirmation that my instincts had been right, added another layer to the fire building inside me, and when Allison emailed me later that afternoon asking for income documents to support my claim as the financially responsible caregiver, I opened my laptop without hesitation. I gathered everything I had kept neatly organized for years: the rental income records, the investment statements, the property tax receipts for the duplexes I had purchased quietly, one through a down payment assistance program for essential workers, the second through disciplined savings, the third through refinancing the first documents that told a story no one in my family had ever cared to ask about. I sent her the files, and within minutes my phone rang again this time, with a moment of silence from her end before she said slowly, "Maya, you own 3 duplexes outright, and you have an investment account with $180,000. Her tone held genuine shock, and for the first time in days, a small flicker of humor rose in my chest, faint but real as I said quietly, "People underestimate quiet women. It is safer that way." Allison let out a low breath, not quite a laugh, but something close, and replied, "I see that now, and I think your sister is about to learn that as well." After the call ended, I stood in the center of the living room and looked around the house that had been the battleground of Lena's cruelty, and something in me hardened into resolve, the kind that does not bend once it forms, and I began preparing for the fight ahead without hesitation. I changed the locks again, more secure this time, and installed ring cameras on the front porch and the side entrance cameras with motion alerts that would notify me instantly if anyone approached. The quiet click of each tool being screwed into place felt like reclaiming territory she had tried to steal from me, and with every action, I felt the fear that had been pressing against my ribs loosen its grip a little more. Then I drove to the courthouse and filed for a temporary restraining order, the clerk reviewing my documentation with growing concern as she read about the bank incident and the forged eviction notice, nodding slowly before handing me the stamped paperwork. I tucked it into my bag with a sense of purpose that steadied my breath, knowing this step alone would disrupt many of Lena's plans. That night, under the warm glow of the lamp in my mother's room, I submitted a formal fraudulent deed investigation request to the state board, attaching copies of the fake document Lena had flaunted and the medical records confirming my father's cognitive impairment. The online form asked for an explanation in my own words, and as I typed the narrative of the past few weeks, I felt the truth settle more firmly inside me, a truth I had forgotten. Under all the humiliation, I am not powerless. I hit submit and sat back in the chair, breathing deeply as the house held a stillness that no longer felt oppressive, but filled with anticipation, as if the walls themselves knew a shift had begun. And in the quiet, I realized that the reversal had already happened. The moment I made the first phone call, the moment I stopped absorbing the blows and began striking back with precision, the story changed. And Lena had no idea yet that every step she took from now on would be a step into consequences she created herself. By the time the fraudulent deed investigation was officially opened and the restraining order had been logged into the system, I knew I needed more than paperwork and legal steps. I needed someone who could trace every shadow Lena had been moving, in someone who understood the way financial abuse could hide behind family smiles and soft voices. So the next morning I called Martin and Cole again and asked Allison if she could recommend a private investigator who handled elder exploitation cases. She did not hesitate. She said one name with a certainty that made something in my chest settle. Jonas Blake, 41, former financial crimes investigator for the state, specializes in elder fraud and coercion. He has seen everything. When I met him that afternoon at a small office near downtown Salem, he looked exactly like someone built to notice the things others overlooked. Calm eyes, steady posture, and a way of listening that made me feel like nothing I said would be dismissed or minimized. I gave him every detail, every document, every photograph, every message, and he listened without interruption until I finished, then closed the folder and said quietly, "I will find what they thought they hid." Over the next few days, he moved faster than I expected, sending me updates that made my stomach twist with both dread and validation, because each new discovery painted the truth of who Lena and Travis really were. On the second day, he called and said he had pulled Lena's credit report through legal channels, his voice carrying a weight that told me he had found more than simple carelessness. She is carrying $53,000 in credit debt. Most of it at high interest rates, and several accounts have been sent to collections. And I felt a slow exhale leave my chest because suddenly so many things made sense. The desperation, the rage, the attempt to seize the house quickly. But he was not finished. He added that she also had a pending eviction from her apartment in Portland, filed 6 weeks earlier, and she had applied for 3 separate quick loan services. Within the last month, each request denied due to unpaid balances and high-risk flags. I sat on the edge of the porch steps with the phone pressed to my ear and stared out at the street while absorbing the truth Lena had not simply wanted the house because it was sentimental. She had needed it to save herself, to sell it fast, and walk away from the debt she dug for years, while everyone else called her the carefree golden child. Jonas moved on to Travis next, and what he uncovered made my breath still. This is where things get darker. He said Travis was arrested in 2019 for identity theft charges, reduced in a plea deal, but the record is still there, and he's been associated with several flagged transactions tied to suspicious account activity. My hand tightened around the phone as I listened, shock rippling through my veins, because this was the man who stood in front of 50 people and declared I should move out in 7 days, the man who acted like I was the problem, the threat, the greedy one. Jonas continued his investigation with a precision that left no corner unseen, and on the 5th day he sent me an audio file that made my blood freeze. He had pulled it from a neighbor who lived in the duplex beside Lena's apartment, someone who had overheard a loud argument and recorded part of it because they were afraid it might escalate into violence. In the recording, Lena's voice was high and sharp and laced with frustration, saying once the house is sold, we split the money. That was the deal, and Travis responded with a low laugh, telling her she had to move faster because debts were piling up. Then she hissed back, I am trying, but the idiot keeps interfering, referring to me as if I were the obstacle standing between her and a jackpot she believed she deserved. I listened to the recording twice, letting each word settle into place like puzzle pieces, forming an image I could not unsee. The image of a sister willing to manipulate our father, forge documents, smear my name publicly, and destroy what was left of our family just to dig herself out of financial ruin. But the worst discovery was still to come, the one that turned my anger into something cold and absolute, the one that made everything in me still with a clarity that almost frightened me. Jonas called late in the afternoon, his tone different this time, heavier, more deliberate, and said, Maya, I need you to sit down for this. I did, gripping the arm of the chair as he explained what he found. He had obtained surveillance footage from the ATM outside the Bank of Oregon branch, footage recorded on the same day Dad had tried to withdraw $38,000. I closed my eyes as he described the video, Lena standing beside Dad at the machine, her body angled in a way that blocked the camera partially, but not completely. Her hand gripping his wrist firmly as she pressed his fingers toward the keypad, guiding his movements, forcing him to enter his PIN, even as he hesitated and turned his head as if confused, and the image hit me so violently I felt a wave of nausea roll through my body. She had physically coerced him, used her strength against his vulnerability, manipulating a man who could no longer separate past from present, who trusted his daughters to protect him, not exploit him. I felt my vision blur for a moment, not from tears, but from the sheer force of my fury, a fury so sharp and clean it drew my focus into a narrow, bright line. Jonas spoke gently, I am forwarding you the footage and the still frames. This is the kind of evidence the state does not overlook, and I nodded even though he could not see me, absorbing the significance of what he had found. As the call ended, I opened the video and watched. Silently watched my father's confused expression. Watched Lena's impatient grip. Watched the way she leaned in close to whisper something that made him flinch slightly. And I felt the last 2 weeks collapse into a single truth. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was elder financial exploitation, a felony, and she had handed me the proof herself. For a long moment, I sat in the dim living room, holding my phone, the house breathing around me like a witness, the weight of my mother's note still tucked inside my pocket, and in that quiet, I felt a steadiness fill me from the inside out. Every loop, every humiliation, every lie, every cruel whisper had led to this moment, a moment where truth finally stepped into the light, and I was ready to use it. By the time I finished watching the ATM footage for the 3rd time, a stillness settled over me, not the fragile kind that follows exhaustion, but the deliberate kind that arrives when a person decides they will no longer react. They will act, they will move with purpose instead of fear, and that clarity stayed with me through the next 48 hours as I built the plan for the family dinner, the one Lana would walk into believing she'd already won. I chose a Thursday evening because relatives were less likely to have conflicting plans, and I sent each of them a simple message that carried no emotion and no hint of what I was preparing dinner at the house on Maple Ridge this week. Important updates about Mom and Dad. I need everyone present. I knew they would come not out of loyalty to me, but because they loved gatherings that promised gossip or closure or drama, and I counted on that predictable weakness to bring them exactly where I needed them to be. Even Lena responded with an overly bright text. "Of course, I will be there," which told me she interpreted my invitation as a surrender, a final attempt to negotiate or plead, and the thought almost made me laugh because she had no idea how thoroughly her own actions had armed me. The next morning, I moved through the house with calm precision, gathering everything Jonas had given me: the printed credit debt summary, the pending eviction documents, the quick loan attempts, the still frames of the ATM footage, the witness audio transcript, and the notarized statements from the teller at the Bank of Oregon. I organized them into neat stacks, then created a digital folder on my laptop containing all of it, along with geotag data Jonas had extracted from Lena's marketplace transactions, each one showing her location inside this house on the very days she claimed she had not stepped foot here. I practiced the sequence of what I would present first, what would follow next, and what evidence would serve as the final blow, moving through it as if preparing for a trial rather than a dinner, and the structure steadied me. I borrowed a small projector from the hospital where I worked, knowing no one questions a nurse who needs equipment for a staff training, and I set it up in the dining room with careful placement so every seat faced the wall where the footage would play. I placed my laptop on the table beside it, the screen dark and closed for now, and for a moment I stood in the center of the room, imagining the way the night would unfold, imagining the shift that would move through the air when the truth began to surface. I invited Dad with the help of his weekday caregiver, reassuring him that it was simply a dinner with family and he would not be asked to make any decisions, and he seemed relieved, his confusion clearing slightly at the idea of being included rather than manipulated. When I called Allison and told her the date and time, she confirmed immediately that she would attend, saying cases like this are best addressed in a group setting where lies collapse under the weight of witnesses, and her calm confidence strengthened my own. The day of the dinner arrived with a strangely bright Oregon sky, sunlight slanting across the porch as if to illuminate everything that had been hidden in the dark for too long. And I spent the afternoon preparing the simplest meal I could manage, not because I cared to impress anyone, but because the ritual of chopping vegetables and stirring simmering pots gave my hands something steady to do. By 6 o'clock, the table was set. The projector stood ready, the documents were arranged, and the house felt poised, like a held breath, waiting. The first car pulled into the driveway at 6:15, an aunt who avoided confrontation but craved spectacle, and she walked in, wearing a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. Others followed cousins, distant relatives, neighbors, who'd become part of the extended family over the years, and then Dad arrived with his caregiver moving slowly, but with a steadiness I had not seen in weeks. He squeezed my hand as he entered, and I felt a warmth swell in my chest, because for the first time since Mom's passing, he looked safe. Then at exactly 6:40, Lena walked through the front door with a swagger that made the room tilt slightly out of balance. Her chin lifted her outfit more polished than usual, as if she were dressing for victory, and behind her stepped a man I immediately recognized, though we had never met, a real estate agent. He extended his hand to me with forced politeness and said he was here to look at the house ahead of the sale, and Lena stood beside him, smiling like a child showing off a prize she had stolen. Several relatives exchanged looks but said nothing, and the agent moved toward the living room with a notebook already evaluating square footage and structural details without my permission. Lena took her seat at the table as if she owned the place and gave me a bright, sugary smile, saying, "I thought you would want things to be handled efficiently," and I felt a quiet calm settle inside me, the kind that arrives moments before a storm breaks open. I let everyone sit, let the noise rise, let the chatter spill across the table, and only when the plates were filled and the room had built enough false comfort did I stand and say in a steady voice, "Thank you all for coming. I have some important information to share. Lena rolled her eyes dramatically, whispering something to the agent who stood in the doorway pretending not to listen, and her confidence radiated through the room like an unpleasant perfume, thick and smug and utterly blind. She believed this meal was a closing act, a final moment where she would parade her victory while I quietly accepted defeat, but she had not understood the shift that had taken place inside me, the shift that had replaced fear with precision, humiliation with clarity, weakness with truth. I walked to the projector, pressed a button, and as the machine hummed to life, the chatter died slowly until the room fell silent. The kind of silence that deepens right before impact. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand calm and steady, and she stopped, her smile flickering slightly at the edges. I turned to the wall where the first still image appeared, a freeze frame of Lena gripping Dad's wrist at the ATM, and the room inhaled sharply, as if the floor had dropped beneath them. I stood there, finally ready, finally steady, and said, "This dinner is not about surrender, it is about truth." The room fell into the kind of silence that feels alive, a silence that stretches, tightens, and vibrates, with the air of something about to break, and as the projector hummed softly behind me, I clicked play, letting the first seconds of the ATM footage fill the wall. At first, there was only the dim glow of the bank canopy, the grainy black and white angle that captured the side of the machine, and then the figures came into view. My father standing unsteady, leaning slightly as if unsure of his own weight, and beside him, Lena, her posture sharp, her grip unmistakably forceful as she wrapped her hand around his wrist to guide his fingers toward the keypad. A gasp moved through the room like a shiver, one person covering their mouth, another leaning forward as if pulling the truth closer, and I watched their shock in the corner of my eye while Lena's face drained of color, her mouth parting slowly before tightening into a panicked line. She tried to speak, a shaky, "I can explain," forming on her lips, but I raised one hand with quiet control, not silencing her with force, but with something stronger, the weight of truth filling the room. The footage continued, showing Dad turning his head in confusion, mumbling something as she pushed his hand closer to the machine, and the recording captured the moment he jerked slightly, as if flinching from a whisper she forced into his ear. When the video ended, there was no applause, no noise, only a suffocating stillness as the room absorbed what they had just seen, and I let the silence settle before clicking to the next slide. The screen brightened to reveal an email blown up large enough for every relative to read the message Lena had sent to a notary 3 weeks before the memorial. My dad has dementia but can still sign if guided. The email header, the timestamp, the words all displayed in stark clarity, and the air in the room thickened as though someone had turned the oxygen down. Lena's chair scraped sharply across the floor as she stood abruptly, her voice quivering with desperation as she stammered, "That is not what it looks like. I was trying to help you. Do not understand." But the room had shifted their eyes, moving from her to the screen and back again, their disbelief turning slowly into something sharper, a collective recognition of betrayal. I stepped closer to the table where my father sat, his hands trembling slightly against the woven placemat, his expression lost but warm, and I touched his shoulder gently before asking in a soft voice that carried through the stillness, "Dad, can you tell everyone who took care of Mom in her last year?" Every face turned toward him, expecting confusion, expecting fragments of thought. But for a moment, a rare clarity passed over him, like a clear morning breaking through weeks of fog. His voice, frail yet steady, filled the air with a sincerity that cracked something open in the room Maya cared for her day and night. He said slowly, searching for me with his eyes as though anchoring himself to memory, "If anyone deserves anything in this house, it is her." The room exhaled all at once, a rush of shock and emotion passing through the relatives who had whispered behind my back for months, and I saw shoulders slump, eyes drop, guilt flicker across faces that had been so quick to judge but so slow to understand. Lena stumbled backward as if struck, her mouth opening and closing without forming words, and she tried again to speak, her voice cracking into a desperate whisper. "Dad, you do not remember correctly. I helped. I was there." But her words fell flat in the air because every person in that room had just watched her manipulate him on the screen, had read her own confession, in the email had heard a truth from my father that she could not twist anymore. My throat tightened with something that felt like justice rising from the ashes of humiliation, and I allowed the moment to breathe before I pulled the final document from the folder on the table. I unfolded it slowly, deliberately, letting the tension stretch until every eye snapped toward me, and then I held up the medical certificate, confirming Dad's dementia diagnosis, dated early 2022. This, I said, clearly means that every signature he made after this date is legally invalid, that no deed, no transfer, no document she pressured him into signing carries any legal weight. A murmur rippled through the room, this time not from confusion, but from understanding, from something like outrage, as the truth settled heavily among them. The real estate agent, who had been leaning casually in the doorway, stiffened, his eyes widening as he realized the implications of standing beside a client who had attempted to list a stolen home, and he straightened abruptly, clearing his throat before saying in a quiet, stunned voice, "I was not aware of any of this. I cannot be involved in something like this." He turned to me with a small, respectful nod, his voice lowered. "I am truly sorry," before gathering his folder and stepping quickly toward the door, leaving Lena standing alone in a room full of people who no longer believed a single word she said. The walls seemed to close in around her as she stared at the projector screen where the still image of her forcing Dad's hand still lingered, and her own reflection in the frame of Mom's portrait seemed to watch her with silent disappointment. Then her composure shattered. Her knees buckled slightly as she fell back into her chair, her breath coming in short gasps, tears spilling over her cheeks as she shook her head over and over, like someone trying to deny the collapse of a reality they had built for themselves. She covered her face with trembling hands, her words muffled and broken. "I was scared. I needed help. I did not think it would go this far." But the room did not rush to comfort her because every person there had witnessed the truth in real time. The deceit, the greed, the calculated cruelty she had inflicted on a dying mother and a vulnerable father. A few relatives looked away, ashamed of how quickly they had taken her side. Others stared at her with wide eyes, stunned by the magnitude of what she had done, and I stood still in the center of the storm, not triumphant, not gloating, but steady, unshaken, anchored by the truth that had finally stepped into the light. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Lena's quiet sobbing and the soft hum of the projector cooling down, and I felt something deep inside me settle, a quiet release from the weight I had been carrying alone for so long. But this was not about watching her fall apart. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen, restoring what had been twisted, and protecting the home my mother had entrusted to me. I clicked the projector off, letting the room return to its warm lamplight glow, and I stood quietly as the final tremor of exposure settled into the air. The truth was no longer hidden, and there was no going back. The room was still vibrating with the aftershock of everything that had been revealed, the air heavy with the kind of silence people keep when they know something irreversible has just happened. And as the relatives drifted out one by one, with stunned faces and murmured apologies for ever doubting me, I stayed standing beside the dining table, letting my breath settle, feeling the weight of the moment ease slowly from my shoulders, even as something new and sharper took its place, the quiet certainty that the consequences were only beginning. By the next morning, the fallout arrived with a speed that felt almost unreal, as though the truth we had exposed the night before had ignited a fuse that raced into every corner of Lena's world. The investigator from Adult Protective Services called me first. his voice crisp and steady as he informed me that the footage, the email, and the documented financial discrepancies were being escalated to an elder financial exploitation case. And I listened silently as he explained procedure, mandatory freezes interviews, and the likelihood of criminal charges, my heart tightening in a complicated knot, because I did not relish watching my own sister face this. Yet I knew she had created every step of this disaster with her own hands. By noon, the bank had frozen her accounts, a standard precaution in suspected exploitation cases. And though I did not see it myself, I heard from one of my aunts that Lena had shown up at the branch, banging on the glass door, begging to be let in, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. Her voice cracking as she tried to convince the teller who had once complimented her on her nail polish that she simply needed access to her money. But the teller had followed protocol and declined to speak with her, beyond directing her to the investigator's contact information, leaving Lena standing on the sidewalk with her hands shaking and her eyes red. I did not gloat, I simply absorbed the reality of it, allowing the consequences to land where they belonged. Travis disappeared almost immediately, leaving behind only a short message on his social media account saying he needed space and hoped everyone would respect his privacy, which was ironic considering he had never respected mine for even a second. And within hours, his profile went silent while Lena tried calling him repeatedly with no answer. Finally sitting outside their apartment complex on the curb, with her phone pressed to her forehead, staring blankly at the pavement as though waiting for him to reappear like some sort of rescue that would never come. The property manager for her building had already taped the second eviction notice to the door. The words, "Final Decision," standing out in bold letters she could not ignore. And though I was not there, I could picture her pulling the notice off with trembling fingers, reading it again and again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into mercy. Meanwhile, the relatives who had whispered behind my back for so long began shifting their tone, calling to check on me, offering food or company or apologies, stumbling over explanations about how they were misled or confused, or trying to stay out of family conflict, and I accepted their words with polite distance, because forgiveness did not have to mean forgetting, and respect once broken takes its time to return. My father moved gently through these days as if carried by the currents of change, rather than dragged by them, and after meeting with the care coordinator, I arranged for him to transition into the senior assisted living community just outside West Salem, a place with warm halls and quiet common rooms, and caregivers who greeted him by name within the first hour. And as I helped him settle into his new room with soft blankets and a view of a maple tree that was just beginning to turn orange, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months, knowing he would finally receive the care he deserved without the chaos Lena had wrapped around him. The days after the exposure felt strange, a mix of relief and exhaustion like the air after a storm, and I moved through them quietly handling paperwork, responding to the attorney cleaning the house room by room as though clearing out the residue of every accusation that had echoed within its walls. On the third afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table sipping lukewarm coffee because I had forgotten about it twice already, when a new email pinged at the top of my inbox, the subject line crisp and simple, "Offer accepted," and for a moment I stared at it without opening it, letting the faint hum of anticipation settle into my chest before I finally clicked it. West Point Property Group is pleased to inform you that your offer on the 12-unit complex on Fairview Drive has been accepted. The sentence glowed on the screen bright and steady, and I felt a quiet shock ripple through me, even though I had been expecting an answer, because seeing it written out like that made the truth of who I really was rise unmistakably to the surface. While Lena had spent months scheming how to take the house, I had been quietly expanding everything my mother had left me, turning the small savings and careful investments into something real and substantial, acquiring properties one by one through patience and discipline, and now I owned more than Lena had ever imagined, more than anyone in that memorial hall would have guessed, just by looking at my worn shoes, or my modest scrubs, or my quiet presence at family gatherings. I leaned back in my chair, running my thumb lightly along the edge of the table my mother had polished every Sunday morning, and I allowed myself a long, slow breath as the meaning settled, in not triumph, not spite, but a profound sense of balance of the universe stitching itself back together after being torn apart. Lena was facing the consequences she had refused to see coming. Consequences rooted in her own choices, and I was stepping into a future I had built quietly while everyone assumed I was barely holding on. The contrast was sharp, almost poetic, and yet I felt no urge to brag or shout or reveal the magnitude of my stability because my strength had never needed to be loud. It only needed to be steady. The night fell softly outside the kitchen windows, the Oregon sky deepening into a cool blue while the neighborhood grew quiet, and I sat there for a long moment absorbing everything: the fallout, the shifting loyalties, the justice that had finally caught up the life I had built, in silence now opening into something wider than before. And as the evening settled fully into the house, I whispered to the empty room, not as a declaration, but as a quiet truth, returning to its rightful place. I protected what was ours. Mom, I kept my promise. The rain had been falling steadily since late afternoon, a soft, relentless curtain that wrapped the house in a muted hush, and I was sitting in the living room with a cup of chamomile tea, growing cool between my hands, when the doorbell rang. A single, hesitant chime that did not match the bravado Lena usually carried like perfume. I set the cup down slowly, my pulse steady but alert, and walked toward the front door, feeling the chill of the evening seeping through the wood as the rain drummed softly overhead. When I opened the door, the porch light spilled over her small, shivering frame, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her thin jacket soaked through her eyes, swollen and red as she lifted her chin just enough to meet mine, and for a moment she did not speak, simply swallowed hard as though the words she had practiced on the drive over were dissolving in her throat. Then her voice cracked into the quiet, soft and trembling, "Maya, can I stay here for a few weeks, just until things calm down? Please, I have nowhere else." And hearing her like that, stripped of pretense, I felt something shift inside me. Not pity exactly, but a sad recognition of how far she had fallen from the version of herself she tried to project. I did not answer right away, letting the rain fill the silence between us, the porch light flickering subtly, as if the house itself were holding its breath, and she continued speaking, words tumbling weakly. "I am sorry, I really am. I should not have done any of it. I was scared and stupid and angry. And when Mom died, I thought I deserved something too. I thought you had everything, and I had nothing. I thought taking the house would make things fair." Her voice broke as she wrapped her arms around herself, her thin frame trembling visibly, and I watched her for a long moment, remembering every insult, every manipulated signature, every lie told. With a steady voice and a rehearsed expression, remembering the night she stood in front of 50 people and tried to rip my home out of my hands with forged documents and false accusations, and I felt the weight of all of it settle quietly into place. I opened the door a little wider, not in invitation but in clarity, letting her see the warmth of the house behind me, the soft light of the hallway, the space she once assumed she would inherit effortlessly. And then I said her name gently but firmly. "Lena, you need to learn to stand on your own feet. No one can save you from the consequences you created, not even me." The words seemed to hit her like a physical force, her breath catching as she blinked rapidly, her lower lip trembling before she bit down on it hard as though bracing against the impact of truth, and she shook her head, a small, desperate gesture. "Please, Maya. I will do anything. I will follow every rule you set. I will change. I promise, just do not make me sleep in my car. I cannot go back to that apartment building. Everyone knows they all saw the sheriff tape the eviction notice on the door." I remained steady, my voice calm but unwavering. "Lena, I will not let you sleep in your car. There are resources shelters, transitional housing programs, places designed to help people rebuild. But you cannot stay here, not in this house, not after what you tried to do to it, not after what you tried to do to Dad, not after you spent months telling people, I was stealing from the family. She pressed her palms against her eyes, her voice warbling into sobs. I thought, if I took the house, everyone would finally see me as worthy. I thought, if I had something big, then maybe I would not feel like the failure everyone thinks I am. And then she whispered something so small I almost missed it. I thought, if I had what you had, then maybe I would stop hating myself. Her honesty, raw and jagged, moved through the rain-chilled air like a confession she had been holding for years. And when she finally lowered her hands, her eyes glistened with something deeper than apology, something like surrender. Then in a voice just above a whisper, she said the words she had never allowed herself to admit. Not even in childhood, Maya. I have been jealous of you my whole life. The admission hung in the air, suspended between us like a truth long overdue. And for a moment, neither of us moved, the rain pattering heavier, as though urging her to say more. She continued haltingly. Every time you succeeded, I felt smaller. Every time Mom praised you, I felt invisible. And when you took care of her, I felt useless, like I had nothing left to offer. So I lashed out. I hurt you. I convinced myself you had everything, just so I could justify wanting to take something from you. And I am so sorry. Her voice cracked into silence, and I felt something inside me soften slightly. Not forgiveness yet, but understanding, the kind of understanding that comes only after wounds have been exposed to light, the kind that acknowledges pain without erasing accountability. I stepped forward just enough that she could see my face clearly, allowing the light from the doorway to illuminate every quiet boundary, every line I was drawing, not from anger, but from self-preservation. And I said gently, Lena, jealousy does not excuse cruelty. Pain does not justify betrayal. What you did hurt our entire family. It hurt Dad. It dishonored Mom, and it nearly cost me my home, and you have to take responsibility for that. She nodded through her tears, her shoulders slumping as though the truth were finally too heavy to resist, and I continued, You will rebuild, but you will rebuild without using me as a crutch, because helping you cannot mean sacrificing my own safety. I will send you a list of transitional housing programs and the contact for a financial counselor. Those are places where you can start fresh, but you cannot stay here. She took a long, shuddering breath, her eyes falling to her soaked shoes, before lifting back up to mine with a trembling acceptance. And she whispered, Thank you not for shelter, but for honesty, as if my refusal itself had given her something she had been missing her entire life, the structure of a boundary she could not manipulate or charm her way past. I watched her step back into the rain, watched her wrap her arms around herself again, watched her nod once, before turning slowly and walking down the driveway, each step heavy but grounded, the beginning of a path she would have to walk alone. I closed the door gently, leaning against it for a moment, as the sound of her footsteps faded into the rain-soaked darkness, and I felt a strange quiet settle in my chest, not triumph, not relief, but the deep, steady calm of a woman who has finally learned how to protect what is hers. 6 months passed with a quiet steadiness I had not felt in years, a kind of slow uncoiling of tension that moved through the house and through my own body as I rebuilt my days piece by piece. And the home that had once been the center of conflict slowly transformed into something fuller and softer, a place of purpose rather than pain. By early spring, the project I had only whispered to myself in the darkest weeks after the memorial finally became real. The house officially registered under its new name, Reed Women's Housing Center, a place designed for women who had been worn down by the same kind of financial manipulation and emotional erosion. I had survived women who had been told they were worthless or invisible, or dependent women whose families had used their vulnerability against them. I walked through the front rooms that first morning after the conversion was finalized, the walls freshly painted a warm, soft cream, the sun filtering through the wide living room windows where my mother used to sit with a blanket over her knees, and I felt something like pride rising quietly within me. Not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the grounded kind that grows when you take something broken and rebuild it into something that can hold others. The first residents arrived, slowly referred by social workers and counseling centers, and I greeted each woman personally, listening to their stories with a calm familiarity, because their words reflected the same wounds I had carried, the same patterns of being overlooked or drained or used by the people who should have protected them. As the weeks passed, the house filled with small sounds of life, the clinking of mugs in the communal kitchen, the soft murmur of late-night conversations, the gentle tread of feet on the stairs, and I felt the house breathing again, finally serving a purpose my mother would have cherished. My father had adjusted well to the senior assisted living community, his days structured with gentle routines, his meals prepared with care, his memory supported by staff who understood the ebb and flow of dementia, and when I visited him each weekend, he smiled with the same warmth he had shown the night he finally defended me in front of the entire family. Sometimes he spoke clearly about Mom, sometimes not, but whenever I told him about the women staying in the house, he would nod slowly and say, "You are doing good work." Maya, and hearing those words, steadied something deep inside me. Life grew quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than lonely, and with the financial stability I had built quietly, over the years, I purchased another property on the east side of Salem, my fifth home, an investment I approached not with arrogance, but with gratitude, knowing how far I had come from the woman everyone thought was barely getting by. One late afternoon in early summer, I stood on the front porch of my mother's house, now the Reed Center, watching the Oregon sky shift into bands of gold and lavender as the sun began to lower behind the tall pines lining Maple Ridge, and the breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. The very garden Mom had tended in her final months with slow, careful hands. I wrapped my arms lightly around myself, feeling the warmth of the moment settle into my chest, and whispered softly into the air as if speaking directly to her. I protected what belonged to our family, Mom. I kept your home safe. The words lifted gently into the breeze as though carried toward her, and I felt a small ache of longing mixed with peace, the kind of bittersweetness that comes only when loss and healing finally learn to sit beside each other. As I stepped back inside the house that evening, ready to prepare dinner for the new residents, I noticed an envelope lying on the hallway table. With my name written in a handwriting, I recognized immediately the looping, careful script my mother had always used when labeling jars or writing holiday cards. My breath caught slightly as I picked it up, the paper soft, from age the seal worn but intact, and I opened it slowly, unfolding the letter with hands that trembled, despite everything I had weathered. Inside there was a short note from my mother, written months before she lost her strength, a note that read, "Maya, if you are reading this, it means you are the one holding our home, the one I always trusted to protect what matters. And there is something I saved for you, something I hope will lift some of the weight you carry." Under the letter was a second document, a bank statement from an account I had never known existed, a small savings fund she had opened long before her illness, quietly adding to it whenever she could. And at the bottom of the page, the balance printed clearly, $210,000. I leaned against the hallway wall, the letter pressed to my chest, the meaning of the gift unfurling slowly inside me like a long-held breath, finally released, and I felt tears gathering, not from pain, but from a deep, overwhelming gratitude, a sense of my mother reaching across time to steady my steps just a little more, offering a final act of love to the daughter who had carried everything in silence. The house grew still around me, The only sound, the soft murmur of distant conversation from the women upstairs, and I allowed myself to cry quietly in the warm lamplight, feeling the full circle of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the exposure, the justice, the rebuilding, all culminating in this gentle final blessing from the one person who had always seen me clearly. When I finally folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the hallway mirror, I whispered one more time, "Thank you, Mom, for trusting me, for believing in me, for knowing I would do the right thing even when no one else did." As the last light of the day filtered softly through the curtains, I felt the peace settle deeper than before, a steady warmth that signaled the true end of the storm. And in that quiet moment, I understood fully that healing does not arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces, in choices, in boundaries, in truth, and sometimes in unexpected gifts left behind by the people who loved us enough to prepare for our strength long before we knew we had it. If you have ever been hurt, dismissed, or financially taken advantage of by someone in your own family, you are not alone, and your voice matters more than you think. So, share your story in the comments, because someone out there might need the strength you found just to make it through another day.